Today I have the brand new Wandering Hour watch in for review by microbrand Atowak. This is very much a hyper watch that competes with super expensive and luxurious watches in terms of the functionality and the design. And this is the most expensive watch that I've reviewed here on the Top Tier Ticker channel. But the question is this watch worth the $2,000 price tag, or is it a watch to avoid? Let's first take a look at why the Wandering Hour complication is so rare and usually only reserved for expensive and luxurious watches. Most watches display the time by free hands slowly sweeping their way around the dial. However, the Wandering Hour complication is different. This is when the watch does not have an hour hand, but instead it somehow points to the hour and jumps to the next one once the hour is over. Theoretically, this actually makes reading the time easier, as the current hour is always being pointed at directly. This type of complication is usually only found in high-end watches, especially when achieved with mechanical components, with the likes of Urwerk being some of the most famous and sought after by collectors. However, those watches cost upwards of 50 grand. So what happens if you want a piece of the Wandering Hour pie but don't fancy selling your kidney on the dark web? Well, thankfully, Atowak have dedicated themselves to try and bring this crazy complication on an affordable budget. Now, it's clear that this Atowak Tarantula is somewhat inspired by various Urwerk models, with a few of them featuring the circular mechanical jumping hour complication. But it's fair to say that this Tarantula isn't a copy, rather a homage in the true sense of the word, taking inspiration but adding their own elements along the way, giving you that hyperwatch aesthetic but bringing it back down to earth with a more mass appealing design. No messing around today, let's dive into the most interesting part of the Tarantula model. Let's take a closer look at the dial. Rather impressively, Atowak has somehow made a very unique looking watch look rather symmetrical and not too unconventional. I personally put this down to the excellent choice of colours and making sure that the focus is exactly where it should be. At the bottom of the dial we see the timekeeping scale. This is a minute track that covers approximately 30% of the dial, with Arabic numerals every 5 minutes and more pronounced numerals every 15 minutes. I think that this is done purely for timekeeping and not for aesthetic purposes, but I do like the white minute track that sits above the numerals. It puts the focus on that part of the watch and makes it easier to read. The rest of the outer dial is completed with almost a traditional set of markings, with dots and lines that emulate the look of hour markers. These, however, don't represent anything and are purely there to give the watch a more cohesive appearance. At the top of the dial we see some printed text, with the Atowak logo at the summit and branding on either side. I don't mind this. I think it would have looked better with just the logo or model name at the top, but it doesn't offend me. Then moving into the centre is where we see the depth of this watch, with the 3-armed Wandering Hour hand at the forefront and a honeycomb Spider-Man suit style texture in the back. I'm very pleased at how deep this dial looks, and even more impressive when you consider the thickness of the watch, which we'll cover a little later in the video. Atowak has nailed the dial for me. It feels like a machine, yet somehow alive at the same time. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, sure, jump hour watches look cool, but how the hell do you read the bloody time? Well, allow me to explain. Reading the time on the Tarantula is a lot easier than it looks at first glance. The timekeeping takes place at the bottom of the dial, with a pointer displaying the hour on its surface and the tip of the pointer displaying the minutes. Of course, a traditional watch is easier to read at a glance, but the Tarantula really doesn't take much adjusting to. I first look at the hour on the pointer, then at the minute. It's as easy as that. The jump hour takes place at the top of the watch, where the pointer will be flipped over to the next hour and slowly make its way around to become the time-telling hand. It is near impossible to tell which second it is though. This watch does have a running seconds, but it's near impossible to track accurately. In the centre of the mechanism we see a Mercedes-style seconds hand, with a triangular construction and dots surrounding it to complete the Mercedes look. Because all 3 points of the shape are the same, it's not possible to distinguish an actual seconds reading. However, I quite like this touch. It's a bit of a nod to the ever so popular Mercedes hour hand that can be found on so many popular watches. So although the timekeeping of the seconds is a bit pointless in this configuration, I like that the watch does have a piece that is constantly moving. It makes the watch feel alive. The spec sheet of a watch is always very important, and that's why we all know that the Moon Swatch is absolutely trash. So how does the spec sheet of the Tarantula hold up for a $2,000 watch. One part of this watch I'm hugely impressed with is the quality of the construction. The watch with the rubber strap comes in at 135 grams, which is around the weight of a modern dive watch, maybe even slightly less. But the watch has that premium feel. It's hard to explain, but you guys who have handled a well-built watch will understand what I mean. It feels tough and rugged, and should be able to take a few knocks without showing the scars. Now, the case on this model is black coated stainless steel, and I'm impressed with the quality of both the black finish and the overall finish of the watch. You can see the finishing of the steel through the black coating, with it having a polished edge around the bezel and brushed finishes to the side case and upper bezel. I think that the black case really helps the watch look smaller on the wrist, but we'll cover this a little later in the video. On the right, we see a signed black crown, which is not screwed down, but the watch does have 50 meters of water resistance, which does mean that this watch is technically swim-proof, although I'd avoid serious water submersion with it. Flipping the watch over, we can see the modified Miyota 9039, which on its own is around a $100 movement. However, this movement has apparently been modified. I'm not sure exactly how, but my guess would be some sort of modification to increase the torque of the watch, as I'm sure it takes a lot more power to move the jump power mechanism over a regular set of hands. The 9039 does have hacking seconds, hand wind, and has a high beat rate. This exact movement is coming in with a -4 seconds a day accuracy. The front crystal is slightly domed, and the back is even more impressive, with the display case back glass actually being slightly curved to fit the wrist. There are screws on the front of the watch in the corners of the bezel, and the edges of the case back holding the watch together. The rubber strap is extremely thick and high quality. It features a rather premium quick release mechanism on the back too, meaning that the second supplied strap can easily be switched over. It comes with a signed deployant buckle that features the same finishing of the case. Now, this is the second Atowak model that I've actually reviewed here on the channel. The first was the Attore Lite back in March 2023. Now, unfortunately, that watch was slightly too big for my personal taste. So does this Tarantula model also fall into that too large category? Well, surprisingly, the Atowak Tarantula actually wears a lot better than I was expecting. I watched the Watchfinder review on this piece when it first got released, and Andrew over at Watchfinder stated that this is a large watch, which it absolutely is. It certainly isn't a small watch by any means, but it's fair to say that I'm shocked at how well the watch actually wears. For reference, my wrist size is only 6.5 inches, and typically I like to wear watches that sit between 36 and 40mm in case size. So at first I thought I was destined to not enjoy the watch because of the size. However, the Tarantula comes in with a 42mm case diameter, a 49mm lug to lug, and a 13.5mm thickness, which on paper is just the size of a standard modern dive watch. Now, of course, due to the dimensions of the case, it does wear a little larger than those dimensions suggest, or rather it looks larger than a 42mm watch would usually look. This is down to the non-traditional case shape, especially around the lugs, but I would say that it wears much like a cushion case dive watch, and I think you'll probably agree that even on my small 6.5 inch wrist, the watch actually wears really well, and even my preference of smaller watches hasn't been offended too much by this watch. I personally like how it looks on my wrist, which is a rare occurrence with a larger ticker like this. Now, there's one part of this watch that I really feel needs highlighting a little bit more, because this is something that can't be written down on a spec sheet, but it's an important factor that I feel often gets overlooked when buying a watch. It feels like almost every single part of this watch has been custom made just for this piece, which I'm sure is a very expensive procedure for Atowak, but you can very much tell that the Atowak has gone to extreme lengths just to make sure that everything is done properly. The curved crystal on the back, the perfectly proportioned dial and case, hell, even the rubber straps perfectly match the aesthetic. It is clear that they didn't just use off-the-shelf parts with the Tarantula. This model has been built from the ground up, not compromising at any point, making sure that the design comes to life exactly how it was intended. Of course, for a balanced review, I must share with you a couple of cons I've found with the Tarantula model. So here are a few things that I don't like about the Tarantula. The first thing I noticed was that although the quality of the rubber strap and buckle is high, it is extremely thick. actually measuring in at 10mm beneath the wrist, which is thicker than some of my actual watches, so this isn't a watch that will be sliding under a cuff anytime soon. The watch does feature lume, but it's average. It certainly won't be telling you the time in the middle of the night. Finally, the crystal does feature some anti-reflective treatment, but it isn't super clear. You still get a lot of reflections in natural light, and in low light situations it's hard to see the back of the dial, but the actual handset is usually easy to read. Big thank you to Atowak for sending this watch over for review. I'm highly impressed with the quality of this watch, and if you like the style of this watch, I highly recommend you go and have a look at their website, which I'll leave a link to down in the description. But if you liked this video and want some more top tier ticker, then be sure to watch my video here where I reviewed the much cheaper and still pretty cool Atowak Ettore Lite.